What happened to serfs after losing someone? The hidden years of mourning no one talks about. Have you ever stood in a place so silent that you could hear the blood rushing through your own veins, only to realize the rhythm wasn't yours alone? Do you believe the soil simply swallows the dead, or does it hold onto their grief like a sponge damp with bitter vinegar? Why do we assume that the end of a pulse is the end of a story in the freezing, isolated mud of the old world? Is it possible that the mourning of the bound was not a ritual, but a structural haunting that lasted for decades? In the shadows of the great estates? What if the history you were taught is merely a polite veil over a reality so cold and suffocating that it would freeze your very soul? You see the past through the safety of distance, but the truth is a jagged, rusted nail pressing against your throat. You are about to enter a world where the boundary between the living and the dead was as thin as a winter shroud. And by the end of this journey, you will understand that some debts are paid in breath, and others in the eternal, agonizing stillness of a house that refuses to be empty. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, unforgiving tree line in the deep woods of the American frontier. The air is sharp, tasting of wet iron and decaying pine needles that crunch like bone under your boots. Inside a leaning log cabin, the fire is dying, and a family has just lost its foundation. In this era, death for the serf was a structural failure. When a body stopped moving, the very walls seemed to tighten. You feel the grit of the dirt floor that has absorbed sweat, spilled milk, and now, the final exhale of a human who owned nothing. The smell is a heavy, stagnant mix of unwashed wool, rancid tallow, and the metallic tang of fear. The movement in the room is sluggish, like being underwater. They move the body with desperate haste, knowing a corpse in a small space is a beckon to the void. The wind outside moans like a constricted throat, scratching at the chimney. There is no softness here. Mourning was a luxury, yet it was a ghost they could not escape. Every pair of hands lost meant a crushing weight for the survivors. The fragility of their existence is laid bare in the flickering, weak candlelight. If the fire goes out, the darkness swallows the memory. This is the beginning of the hidden years, where the living and the dead occupied the same suffocating space. The survival of the family depended on a cruel, mechanical efficiency. Every tool is now a reminder of a void. They look at the empty stool by the fire with hollow terror, knowing the silence will grow into a scream. The stability of their world was built on the backs of many, and when one spine snapped, the roof groaned. As you stand in the doorway, feeling the draft pull at your clothes like invisible fingers, you realize the horror is in the lingering. The air stays cold in the spot where the bed once sat. The shadows are heavy. You witness a grief with no name, whispered in the dark so the masters wouldn't hear the loss of productivity. This is the desperate haunting of the poor. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because here we go down to the depths of the truths that time has tried to bury, revealing the whispers that official history is afraid to repeat so that you never see the past with the same eyes again. The architecture of silence in these forgotten settlements was never meant to protect the soul. It was designed only to contain the body until it could work no more. As you move deeper into the interior of this dwelling, the air grows increasingly stagnant, trapped by thick walls of mud and timber that seem to pulse with a low, rhythmic vibration. Can you feel the texture of the atmosphere? It is a heavy, suffocating blanket of moisture and soot that clings to your skin like a second, unwanted layer of clothing. The light here is a scarce commodity, filtered through greased paper windows that turn the world outside into a distorted, gray smudge. In this dimness, every corner becomes a sanctuary for things that do not belong to the light. You are standing in a space where the ceiling is so low it feels as though the weight of the entire American wilderness is pressing down on the crown of your head. The wood of the floorboards is dark, stained by decades of spilled tallow and the constant dragging of heavy, exhausted limbs. There is a specific sound to this isolation, a creaking of the structure that sounds like a joint being slowly pulled from its socket. It is the sound of a house that is mourning alongside its inhabitants, a structural groan that signals the loss of its internal integrity. Observe the way the living survivors move through this space. They do not walk. They glide with a hushed, frantic caution, as if the floor might give way to a bottomless pit if they step too firmly. The loss of a loved one in this environment transformed the home into a labyrinth of traumatic triggers. Every object is a relic of a vanished utility. You see a rusted iron pot hanging over the fire, its surface pitted and cold. To you, it is an antique. To them, it is a vessel that now cooks half as much. A reminder of the mouth that no longer needs feeding and the hands that no longer help carry the water. This is the sensory reality of the hidden years, the smell of stagnant water in the wash basin, the sight of a half-mentioned shirt draped over a chair like a shed skin, the feeling of a draft that always seems to originate from the exact spot where the deceased used to sit. The house has become a living record of an absence. It is an architecture designed for survival that has suddenly become an echo chamber for the dead. The heat from the heart does not reach the corners of the room, leaving pockets of ancient, biting frost that feels like a physical touch when you pass through them. The isolation was not just physical. It was a sensory deprivation that warped the mind. Outside, the forest is a wall of black needles, a barrier that ensures no one will hear a cry for help. You hear the scratching of vermin inside the walls, a dry, frantic sound that mimics the frantic thoughts of those trapped within. Why does the darkness in the hallway seem more opaque than the darkness outside? Because it is thick with the residue of a life that was never allowed to say a final goodbye. In these cabins, the boundaries between rooms are non-existent, yet the emotional distance between the survivors is a vast, icy canyon. They look at each other and see the same reflection of dread. They are afraid to speak because the sound of a voice might break the fragile spell of their denial. The flickering light casts long, distorted shadows that dance across the rough-hewn beams, creating the illusion of figures standing just out of sight. You turn your head, but there is nothing there, only the smell of damp earth rising from the floor and the realization that the silence is not empty. It is a presence. It is a dense vibrating force that demands your total attention, drawing you into a state of hyper-awareness where even your own heartbeat sounds like an intrusion. This structural silence was essential for the order of the land. If the serfs were allowed to scream, if they were allowed to externalize their grief, the fabric of their forced labor would be unravel. They were forced to internalize the horror, to pack it into the cracks of the walls like insulation against the wind. You realize now that the very buildings were constructed to suppress the human spirit, to ensure that the mourning process remained a private, festering wound that never had the chance to heal. The contrast is jarring, the immense, wild freedom of the American landscape just outside the door, and the claustrophobic, haunted cage of the interior. It is a tension that vibrates in the marrow of your bones. You feel the urge to run, to burst through the door and breathe the night air. But you are held in place by the sheer gravity of their collective sorrow. This is the hidden architecture of the American dream's foundation, a basement of souls where the sun never truly rises. As you stare into the dying embers of the fire, the red glow reflecting in your eyes, I want you to feel the weight of this hidden history and take a moment to acknowledge the depth of this darkness. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "The walls still remember their names, because some tragedies are too heavy to be carried alone." And your voice is the only thing that can break this centuries-old silence. Beyond the physical walls and the oppressive silence lies a deeper, more treacherous layer of the hidden years, the spiritual thresholds that the survivors were forced to patrol with a trembling, desperate vigilance. You find yourself now at the very edge of the cabin's perimeter, where the groomed, hard-packed dirt of the yard meets the chaotic, encroaching tangle of the black forest. In this world, the door was not just a piece of wood. It was a desperate, thin barrier against a landscape that was believed to be populated by the restless and the wronged. You can feel the texture of the threshold under your fingertips. The wood is notched with protective symbols. Small, jagged carvings intended to ward off the very person who was buried only days ago. This is the paradox of their grief. The person they loved in life has become a source of profound, shivering terror in death. In the minds of the bound, a soul that left the body in such a state of misery and exhaustion could not possibly find rest. It would linger, searching for the warmth of the hearth, for the touch of the living, for the life that was stolen by endless toil. The atmosphere here is thin and electric, a high-pitched frequency of anxiety that makes the hair on your arms stand up. You hear a snap of a twig in the distance, and your heart stutters, because in this darkness, there are no accidents, only omens. The rituals of protection were visceral and frantic. You watch as a woman spills a circle of salt across the floorboards, her movements sharp and mechanical. The sound of the grains hitting the wood is like a shower of tiny, dry sparks. They turn the mirrors to face the wall, fearing that a glimpse of the deceased's reflection would trap their own soul in a world of silver and shadows. The light from the single oil lamp is a sickly yellow, casting a glow that doesn't illuminate so much as it reveals the density of the air. You smell the pungent, suffocating scent of burnt herbs, rosemary, and sage yews, not for fragrance, but to mask the scent of decay that they imagine is seeping through the floor. Everything is a ritual of exclusion. The dead are no longer kin. They are a threat to the stability of the living. This transition is the most horrific part of the mourning period. The memory of a smile is replaced by the fear of a spectral knock at the door. The warmth of a shared bed is replaced by the icy dread of a cold spot in the straw mattress. You are witnessing the systematic dehumanization of the departed, a necessary cruelty born from the need to survive the night. The functional reality of this fear was a total breakdown of sleep. You see the survivors sitting upright, their eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at the latch of the door as it rattles in the wind. Every sound is analyzed. Was that the settling of the house, or the heavy, dragging footstep of the one who used to walk here? The pressure of this constant vigilance is a physical weight, a tightening of the chest that never releases. They were trapped in a cycle of sensory hyper-awareness where the wind was a voice and the shadows were silhouettes. The contrast between the safety they craved and the risk they lived in is absolute. If they succumb to fear, they cannot work. If they do not work, they starve. Thus, the fear must be integrated into the work. They carry their terror into the fields, looking over their shoulders at the tree line, convinced that the rustle of the corn is the whisper of a ghost demanding justice. The stability of the plantation depended on this fear, remaining internal, a private haunting that kept the serfs isolated from one another. They were too afraid of the dead to unite among the living. As the weeks turn into months, the threshold of the unseen begins to blur. The survivors begin to speak to the empty air, half praying, half pleading for the spirits to move on. The sensory detail of this environment is a masterclass in psychological erosion, the constant taste of wood smoke, the perpetual dampness of the clothing, the rhythmic dripping of melting snow from the eaves. It is a slow-motion haunting, a grinding down of the human psyche until the distinction between the ghost and the mourner disappears. They become shadows themselves, moving through a world that no longer feels solid. You realize that the hidden years are not just a time on a calendar, but a state of being where the soul is suspended between two worlds, neither fully alive nor allowed to be dead. This is the ultimate cost of a life. Without agency, even your grief is owned by the darkness of the land. It is a profound, echoing tragedy that resonates through the very soil you are standing on. Give a like to this video to honor those whose stories were buried in the silence of the woods, ensuring that their struggle is finally seen in the light of day. The sound of absence in the deep winter of the American colonies was not a lack of noise, but a frequency of madness. As the snow piles against the cabin walls, reaching the height of the windows, the world outside ceases to exist, leaving you trapped in a wooden box with the psychological debris of the lost. You can hear the silence now is a heavy thrumming roar that vibrates in the inner ear. It is the sound of a voice that should be humming a tune but is instead replaced by the rhythmic, sharp crackle of a fire that provides light but no comfort. In this suffocating enclosure, the survivors begin to experience the auditory ghosting of their reality. You watch as a child turns their head sharply toward a corner, convinced they heard the scrape of a boot on the floorboards. The air is so cold it feels brittle, and every pop of the drying timber sounds like a gunshot in the stagnant air. This is the sensory breakdown of the years when the mind, starved of external stimulation and crushed by the density of grief, begins to manufacture the very presence it fears most. The physical labor of mourning continues in the dark, a mechanical grind that keeps the hands moving while the spirit atrophies. You see them spinning wool or sharpening tools by the dim light of a single tallow candle, their movements repetitive and hypnotic. The smell of the room has changed. It is no longer just wood smoke and damp earth, but the sour, acidic scent of prolonged human stress. There is no privacy for this descent into sorrow. Every sob is heard by the entire household, every nightmare shared in the communal bed of straw and coarse fabric. You feel the texture of the air. It is thick with the moisture of breath, a visible mist that hangs in the room, making it feel as though you are breathing in the very essence of the people surrounding you. This is a communal haunting, where the trauma of one becomes the atmosphere for all. The structural integrity of the family is fraying, the threads of their shared reality snapping under the tension of an absence that occupies more space than a living person ever could. Contrast this internal chaos with the frozen, unyielding stability of the world outside. The landscape is a masterpiece of white and black, a sterile environment where the rules of life are suspended. If a survivor wanders too far from the hearth, the cold doesn't just bite. It claims. This creates a terrifying magnetism toward the center of the room. A forced intimacy that creates a different kind of horror, the horror of being unable to escape the gaze of those who share your loss. They look at you and see the ghost you are trying to forget. They are the mirrors of your own haunting. You notice how they avoid looking at the empty space at the table, yet their entire bodies are angled toward it, as if leaning into a vacuum. The functional necessity of staying together for warmth and safety becomes a psychological prison. To survive the winter, they must endure the constant sensory bombardment of their own grief, a process that turns the home into a site of slow-motion emotional erosion. As the sun begins to set earlier each day, the shadows stretch across the floor like long, skeletal fingers, reclaiming the territory of the living. You realize that the hidden years were defined by this slow surrender to the dark. There was no moving on, only a gradual blending of the self with the environment of loss. The significance of this is profound. It reveals a level of human endurance that borders on the supernatural. These were people who lived with ghosts not as metaphors, but as roommates. They carved a life out of a nightmare, finding the will to stoke the fire even when they wished for the cold to take them. The tragedy is not that they died, but that they were forced to live so vividly in the shadow of death. Take a moment to think about the strength required to stay in that room, day after day, and realize how much of your own history is built upon this silent, terrifying resilience. It is vital that we spread these accounts of the unseen. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the stories that were whispered in the dark, so that we can finally bring these hidden years into the light of shared human experience. The tools of survival in the hands of a grieving serf were never just implements of labor. They were the heavy, physical manifestations of a haunting that no one dared to name. As the winter frost begins to crack under the pale, weak sun of early spring, you move with the survivors into the gray fields, where the mud is the color of old bruises and the air smells of thawing rot. Look at the shovel leaning against the fence. The handle is worn smoothly by the grip of a man who is no longer here to hold it. When you touch the cold iron of the plow, you aren't just feeling metal. You are feeling the residual vibration of a life spent in forced rhythm with the earth. Every tool in this environment is a ghost. Every scythe, every bucket, every rusted nail is a tactile reminder of a missing limb in the collective body of the workforce. In the hidden years of mourning, the tragedy was found in the functionality of the mundane. The plow doesn't move itself, and as you watch the survivor strain against the weight of the soil, you feel the phantom pressure of the one who used to push from the other side. This is the sensory weight of absence, a physical resistance in the air, a heaviness in the tools that makes every hour of work feel like a day of penance. The rhythm of the work is different now. It is jagged and uncoordinated. You hear the sound of the axe hitting the wood, but the echo in the valley feels hollow, as if the forest itself is mocking the effort. The texture of the wood is rough, the splints drawing blood from hands that are too cold to feel the sting. This is where the contrast between abundance and scarcity becomes a weapon of the mind. The land demands an abundance of energy, but the soul is in a state of total scarcity. To the masters, a dead serf was a lost asset, a broken gear in a machine of profit. To the survivors, that loss was a hole in the sky. You see them looking at the horizon, their eyes glazed with a fatigue that no amount of sleep can cure. They are working to sustain a life that has lost its color, moving through the movements of survival, because the alternative, the stillness of the grave, is the very thing they are trying to outrun. The stability of the plant action is maintained by this desperate, grinding momentum, a functional necessity that masks the deep, structural collapse of the human spirit within. Notice the way the atmosphere shifts when the sun begins to dip behind the jagged tree line. The fields, once a place of open labor, become a landscape of shifting silhouettes. The tall grass brushes against your legs like whispers, and the smell of the damp earth rises up to meet you, thick and cloying. You realize that for these people, the earth was not a source of life, but a hungry mouth that had already swallowed their hearts. The tools they carry back to the sheds feel heavy in the twilight, the iron glowing with a dull, cold light. There is a profound psychological horror in this transition, the realization that you are working the same soil that holds the remains of your history. The boundary between the farm and the cemetery is non-existent. You are walking on the dead to feed the living, a cycle of existence that strips away the dignity of mourning and replaces it with the cold, mechanical reality of the harvest. The pressure of this realization is a physical ache in the chest, a feeling of being buried alive while still drawing breath. As you stand in the darkening yard, watching the survivors clean the mud from their boots with trembling fingers, you see the true face of the hidden years. It is not a face of tears, but of stone. They have become as hard and unyielding as the tools they use, their emotions tempered in the forge of a relentless, unforgiving reality. The significance of this goes beyond simple grief. It is a testament to the brutal efficiency of a system that demanded productivity even from the hollowed-out shells of the broken. They were the invisible pillars of a world that refused to acknowledge their pain, turning their mourning into a silent, internal fuel for the machine of progress. Feel the cold of the evening air as it settles into your marrow, and recognize the immense, terrifying strength of those who continued to toil when the world had gone dark. This was a labor of shadows, a construction of a future built upon a foundation of unutterable loss. You are part of this history now, a witness to the strength that grew in the cracks of a broken heart. The community of shadows was a fragile network of broken gases and shared, unspoken terrors. In the small, cramped quarters of the slave and serf quarters, mourning was not an individual act, but a localized contagion that spread through the walls. You step into the communal space where the evening meal is being prepared, and the air is thick with the smell of scorched cornmeal and the heavy, humid scent of too many bodies in a confined space. The light from the central fire is erratic, throwing long jerking shadows against the walls that seem to move independently of the people casting them. Here, you feel the density of a collective haunting. When one person loses a father, a sister, or a child, the entire community feels the structural shift in the dark. It is as if an invisible thread has been pulled taut, vibrating with the frequency of a shared trauma. You see them sitting together, yet each is an island of isolation. They do not comfort each other with words. Words are dangerous. Words can be overheard. Words can break the fragile dam holding back a flood of despair. Instead, they share a sensory language of silence. A nod of the head, a hand placed briefly on a shoulder, the rhythmic tapping of a foot on the packed earth. The fear of the returning dead was a communal burden. You hear the whispers in the corner, hushed conversations about how the air turned cold in the barn, or how the hounds barked in a space where no one stood. They believed that grief, if not contained, could act as a beacon, drawing the restless spirits back to the places of their suffering. This created a social pressure to suppress the outward signs of mourning. To cry too loudly was to put the entire community at risk of a visitation. You are witnessing a society that has policed its own heart, turning the natural process of loss into a clandestine, fearful operation. The contrast between the internal explosion of grief and the external mask of stoicism is a source of immense psychological tension. It is a pressure cooker of the soul, where the steam has no vent. You feel the vibration of this suppressed energy in the air. It is a low hum of anxiety that never stops, a background noise to every interaction and every meal. The functionality of the group depended on this suppression. If the community succumbed to the melancholy, as the masters called it, the work would stop and the consequences would be violent. Thus, the survivors became each other's keepers and each other's jailers. You watch a younger man begin to shake, his breath coming in ragged gasps, only for an elder to grip his arm with a strength that is both a support and a warning. They are maintaining the stability of their cage. The H-aura here is not from a monster in the woods, but from the realization that they are forced to be complicit in the erasure of their own loved ones. To survive, they must pretend the dead never existed. They must step over the empty spaces in the circle as if they were never filled. This is the ultimate dehumanization, the theft of the right to remember. The atmosphere in the room is suffocating, not just from the smoke, but from the weight of all the names that are no longer allowed to be spoken aloud. As the fire dies down to glowing red eyes in the dark, the community of shadows prepares for another night of hypervigilance. You realize that the hidden years were a time of profound, forced amnesia, where the only way to harden was to forget the texture of the voices they once loved. The significance of this communal silence is staggering. It was a survival strategy that required the slow, systematic killing of the self. They lived in a world of ghosts because they were not allowed to be fully alive. The mourning was a subterranean river, flowing beneath the surface of their daily lives, invisible but powerful enough to erode the very ground they stood on. As you look into the tired, shadowed faces of these people, understand that their silence was not a lack of feeling, but a profound, heroic act of endurance. You are the vessel for their forgotten stories now. Leave a comment with the phrase "the silence was their only shield" to honor the weight of the words they were never permitted to say, ensuring that their unspoken grief finally finds an echo in the modern world. The spectral hierarchies of the American plantation were as rigid as the laws of the land, creating a chasm between the mourning of the master and the disappearance of the servant. You stand now in the shadow of the great house, a structure of white columns and cold stone that looms over the shacks like a silent judge. When death visited the manor, it was an event of public theater. Black crepe hung from the balconies. Clocks were stopped, and the air was filled with the professional wailing of a society that could afford to perform its grief. But as you turn your gaze back toward the mud street cabins of the serfs, you feel the stinging contrast. For the bound There was no theater, only the mechanical necessity of replacement. To the hierarchy, the death of a serf was not the passing of a soul, but the expiration of a tool. You can smell the difference in the air, the scent of expensive lily and beeswax from the big house, clashing with the raw, metallic stench of the damp earth and unwashed anxiety in the quarters. This is the structural horror of the hidden years, the realization that your very grief is ranked and filed by those who own your breath. The sensory experience of this hierarchy was a constant, humiliating pressure. You watch as a supervisor walks through the rows of workers, his eyes scanning not for faces, but for the slowing of a rhythm. If a man's shoulders sagged under the weight of a lost brother, it was seen as a defect in the machinery. The sound of the whip or the sharp, barked command served as a brutal metronome, forcing the mourning into the marrow of the bones where it couldn't be seen. You feel the texture of this existence. It is the grit of the soil in your mouth, the salt of tears that you are forced to swallow so they don't stain the work. The stability of the entire economic system relied on this chilling indifference. If the master recognized the humanity of the serf's loss, the illusion of ownership would shatter. Therefore, the mourning had to be hidden, buried in the middle of the night, or whispered into the furrows of the field. It was a secret history of the heart, written in the language of exhaustion. Notice the way the landscape itself reflects this divide. The master is buried under a marble slab, a heavy, permanent scream against the passage of time. The serf is laid in an unmarked trench at the edge of the woods, where the roots of the trees will eventually dismantle the bones. This is the final structural insult, the erasure of the physical location of memory. You see the survivors trying to mark the spot with a simple stone or a bit of colored glass, only for the rain and the mud to reclaim it within a season. The fragility of their legacy is a physical ache. They are living in a world where even the ground is a collaborator in their forgetting. The contrast between the marble and the mud is the ultimate expression of the dynamic power that defined their lives. It wasn't just that they lost someone. It was that they were told the loss didn't matter. The psychological weight of this invalidation is a slow-acting poison, a density that makes the very air feel like lead. As you stand between the grand monument and the overgrown thicket of the nameless, you realize the profound elevation of this tragedy. These people were forced to invent a dignity that the world denied them. Their mourning became a form of resistance, a quiet, stubborn refusal to let a life be treated as a mere statistic. Every secret prayer, every hidden tear, was a claim to a humanity that the hierarchy tried to strip away. The significance of the hidden years is found in this silent battle for the soul. They kept the memory alive in the darkness, nourishing it with the only thing they truly owned, their internal world. You are standing on the ruins of a system that tried to turn humans into shadows. Yet the shadows are the only things that remain to tell the truth. Liking this video is an act of recognition towards those who have been forced to suffer invisibility, ensuring that the hierarchy of silence is finally overturned by the force of our collective memory. The decay of memory is a slow, rhythmic erosion that occurs when a name is no longer fed by the breath of the living. You are now witnessing the midpoint of the hidden years, a time when the sharp, jagged edges of the initial loss have been worn down into a smooth, dull ache. The cabin looks the same, the fields haven't changed, but the atmosphere has thinned. You can feel the evaporation of a presence. The things that once belonged to the deceased, the worn boots, the carved wooden spoon, have been absorbed back into the communal pool of survival. They have been touched by so many hands now that the original thumbprint of the owner has disappeared. This is the sensory horror of poverty. You cannot afford to keep a shrine. To survive, you must use the ghost's tools until they break. You must wear the ghost's coat until it threads. The smell of the person has been replaced by the neutral, biting scent of lye and wood ash. It is a biological erasure, a systematic dismantling of a legacy through the simple, daily act of staying alive. The soundscape of the cabin has changed. The frantic, whispered prayers of the first year have been replaced by a heavy, functional silence. You hear the rhythmic scratching of a pen on a ledger in the distance. The masters record where the deceased is now just a crossed-out line, a zero in the column of assets. But inside the cabin, the memory is a flickering candle in a drafty room. You see an elder trying to tell a story of the one who is gone, but the children's eyes are blank. They only know the hunger of the present. The texture of the past is becoming translucent. When you reach out to touch the memory, your fingers pass right through it, encountering only the cold, damp wood of the reality you are trapped in. This is the most terrifying stage of the mourning, not the haunting, but the forgetting. The fear that the person you loved is being recycled into the mud of the frontier, their essence scattered like chaff in the wind. Contrast this internal decay with the relentless, vibrating growth of the American wild. The forest doesn't care about your names. The vines wrap around the fence posts, the moss swallows the stones, and the cycle of nature continues with a terrifying, mindless abundance. The stability of the land is built on this consumption of the individual. You realize that the hidden years are the time it takes for the earth to fully digest a human life. The survivors are watching themselves disappear in real time, seeing their own future in the fading memory of their dead. They are the guardians of a vanishing flame, their hands cupped around a light that is destined to go out. The psychological pressure of being the last person and brushing lonely burden. It creates a state of hypervigilance where every dream is a desperate attempt to reconstruct a face that the waking world is trying to erase. As the twilight settles over the settlement, you feel the pound for denti of me or a world that's only Auchipuchi. The significance of the hidden years is a warning about the cost of a society that forgets its foundations. These serfs were the living memory of a stolen world, and as their memories decayed, a piece of the human story was lost forever. But you are here now, your presence acting as a witness to the erasure. The decay is not total as long as someone is willing to look into the shadows. You are the bridge between their silence and the modern word. Share this video with those who seek truth in the gaps of history. Because by spreading these words, you are preventing time from completing its work of erasing those who built the world with their sweat and silent mourning. The final transition of the hidden years is not marked by a sudden light, but by a heavy chemical change in the very air of the cabin. You are standing in the center of the room now, and the atmosphere has reached a state of total saturation. It is a dense, vibrating stillness, where the material rot of the wood and the spiritual decay of the memory have fused into a single, unbreakable reality. Can you feel the temperature? It is a stagnant, damp cold that doesn't just touch your skin, it sees into your marrow like mercury. The survivors have stopped looking for ghosts in the corners because they have realized that they themselves have become the architecture of the haunting. The functional necessity of the hearth has faded as the spring air turns thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and wet earth. A sensory contrast that feels like an insult to the stagnant heart of the home. In this phase, the elevation begins. The concrete struggle of the serf is no longer about the shovel or the plow, but about the terrifying, philosophical weight of being the last witness to a disappeared world. Observe the hands of the woman sitting by the window. They are no longer trembling. They are as still as the stones in the creek. She is touching a piece of frayed ribbon, the last material anchor to the one she lost years ago. The texture of the ribbon is slick with the oils of her skin, worn down to a ghostly translucence. This is the transition from grief to a permanent state of being. The stability of her life is now built upon the absence, a structural void that she carries within her like a vital organ. The contrast between her internal silence and the violent, bursting abundance of the American wilderness outside is absolute. The forest is screaming with life, cicadas buzzing in a rhythmic, deafening roar. Birds darting through the canopy like sparks while she remains a monument to a stillness that the world has forgotten. You realize that the hidden years were a cocoon, and what has emerged is not a restored person, but a human transformed into a living reliquary. The significance of this elevation is profound. These people, stripped of their names, their property, and their right to mourn, achieved a state of tragic grace that no marble monument could ever capture. They turned the raw, jagged material of their suffering into a quiet, internal dignity. You see it in the way they look at the horizon not with hope but with a deep, ancestral recognition of the cost of the ground they stand on. The horror has moved from the external jump scare of a shadow to the internal, existential dread of a life that was lived in the gaps of history. This is the hidden truth of the American foundation. It is held together by the gravity of these unspoken sorrows. The fragile balance of the society above depended on the absolute suppression of this weight below. But as you stand here, feeling the floorboards groan under your feet, you know that the weight is still there. It is a geological layer of grief that supports everything you see. As the sun casts its final, golden rays across the dirt floor, illuminating the dust motes that dance like tiny, glowing spirits, the transition is complete. The individual mourning has ended, and the eternal haunting has begun. You are no longer just an observer. You are a participant in the preservation of a frequency that was meant to be silenced forever. This is the moment where the concrete becomes the eternal. The smell of the wood smoke, the sound of the wind, the cold of the mud, they are all parts of a single, vast poem of endurance. Take a moment to feel the sheer scale of this history. Leave your final tribute to this journey. Sharing this video is the only way to ensure that the darkness of the past doesn't consume the lessons we need for the future. The echo in the modern soul is the final, shivering resonance of the hidden years. A sound that has traveled through centuries of soil and stone to find you here, in the cold light of the present. What happened to serfs? After losing someone, the hidden years of mourning no one talks about, we have walked through the mud, felt the bite of the colonial winter, and stood in the suffocating silence of cabins that were built to be prisons of the spirit. But as you look around your own world now, do you not feel the same thinness in the air? Have you not noticed how the shadows in your own life seem to have a weight that science cannot explain? Is it possible that the mourning of the nameless never truly ended, but simply changed its frequency to match the hum of our modern machines? Why do we feel a sudden chill in places where nothing has happened for 100 years? Are we the ones who are truly living, or are we merely the latest tenants in a house that belongs to the dead? The sensory journey ends here, at the threshold of your own perception. You can still smell the faint, ghostly scent of wood ash if you breathe deeply enough. You can still hear the rhythmic, distant thud of a heartbeat that isn't your own. The texture of the past is not a memory. It is a physical presence that coats the world like a fine layer of dust. The contrast between our loud, bright, distracted lives and the deep, dark focus of those who suffered before us is the ultimate revelation. They lived with a clarity of loss that we can barely imagine, a structural integrity of the soul that was forged in the absolute absence of comfort. The stability of our current reality is a thin crust over an ocean of their tears. The hidden years were not a time of waiting. They were a time of becoming. Those who lost everything became the very ghosts that now guard the truth of our origins. The significance of this journey is not found in the facts of history, but in the feeling of the haunting. We are the descendants of those who hardened the unendurable. Every time you feel a sense of unearned sorrow, every time you stare into the dark and feel a presence you cannot name, you are touching the hem of their tattered coats. They are inviting you to remember. They are demanding that their hidden years be brought into the light of your consciousness. The horror was never the death. The horror was the forgetting. But today, the forgetting has ended. You have seen the architecture of their silence, and by seeing it, you have broken the spell. The hidden years are no longer hidden. They are written in the marrow of your bones and the rhythm of your breath. As we reach the final moment of this immersive descent, I ask you to carry this weight with you. Do not let the door close on the silence of the woods. Keep the fire of your memory burning in the heart of your own mind. If you have felt the cold of their world reaching through the screen, if you have recognized the strength in their shadows, then you are the one we have been waiting for. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because our mission is to rescue the voices that time has tried to silence, bringing to light the stories that shaped our existence in the shadows. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this case. Leave a comment saying I've watched this far, so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Leave a like as a final tribute to these lost names and share this video so that the echo of their lives can finally reach every corner of the modern world. Their mourning has ended, but our memory has only begun. In the end, what remains is the sound of the wind blowing through the cracks of a story that can no longer be ignored. As every speck of dust on this ground carries the weight of a secret that now, and only now, belongs to you. Let silence be your prayer, and memory your greatest tool of justice against the absolute oblivion that they tried to impose on us. The end is just a new threshold,